Reading from the first book of Samuel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he'll kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him with trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said peaceably, "I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Amminadab and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. The word of the Lord.
The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. He revives my soul and guides me along right pathways for his name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You spread a table before me in the presence of those who trouble me. You have anointed my head with oil, and my cup is running over. Surely your goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
A reading from the letter to the Ephesians. Once you were in darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do in secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." The word of the Lord.
Our gospel this morning is quite long. If you would need or would like to sit down, please do. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John. Glory to you, Lord Christ. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is still day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews, the religious leaders, did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish religious leaders, for they had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been born blind, and they asked him, "Give glory to God," which means tell the truth. "We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and that those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains." The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Grace to you and peace. Good morning. There's a story that floated around in first century, in the ancient Near East in the first century, about these money changers who would take coins that had been minted, and they would take the coins, and because when the metal was boiled and turned into liquid, they would press them in these presses, and then some of the extra liquid would sort of seep out around the press, but that was supposed to be there because that was what made the coin a full weighted coin. But then there were some money changers who were not quite so honest, and what they would do is they would take a knife and they would trim the edges around the coins to make them perfectly round, therefore reducing the weight of the coin, but using the extra to create more coins. Those people who did that were certainly called dishonest, but there were those money changers who had integrity, and those would never trim the edges off of the coins. They were considered to be, in that century, honest of heart. I love that. So in our Old Testament lesson this morning, we're over into the narrative about King Saul and King David, and the prophet Samuel has previously anointed Saul as king. He was a good king to start off with, but he became a little crazy over time. He began to lose his mind, partly because the Philistines were overrunning the Israelite communities, and they couldn't hold on to all their lands. So Saul began to feel as though he was inept as a king, and when he began to feel inept and was unable to take the steps that a king would take in order to save his kingdom, so to speak, God tells the prophet Samuel that Saul has fallen out of favor with him and that it was time to anoint a new king. Well, Samuel's scared that this is going to happen. When God tells Samuel to go anoint a new king, he feels as though he must come up with a story so that when Samuel hears that he's coming, he won't be upset. And most of the time when a prophet showed up, it wasn't good news. So Samuel goes to Saul and says, I've come peaceably. I just came to worship and to sacrifice, and I wanted to invite Jesse to the sacrifice. So they go to this faux sacrifice, and Samuel says to Jesse, one of your children is the king, and I have come to anoint him. So you know the story. They go through all 7 of the older brothers, and Samuel does not see in any of them any kind of depth or courage of heart, anything that would lead him to believe, or God to believe, that person could lead a nation with God's help. And so he tells Jesse, do you have any other sons? And he said, well, I've got the youngest, but he's out in the field. So you know the story, bring him to, and Samuel anoints David as the next king of Israel. What happens after that is that David becomes part of King Saul's court. And because David is a gifted man, he's able to play the lyre and to soothe Samuel in his grief over not being a good king. So he begins to play, and Saul begins to feel much better. And so David and Saul actually become quite close. Well, after they've become quite close, the Philistines are still trying to overrun the Israelites. And they're worried because there is this giant Philistine. We often call him Goliath, but in the text it's just the Philistine. So they have this big Philistine, and everybody's scared of him because he leads the Philistine army, and he overruns all the Israelites. And David says, let me go. I will fight the big Philistine. And then Saul says, here, wear all my battle gear, and he puts on all this armor, and David's so small he can't even wear it, can't even walk. So he says, I'm not wearing that, and he takes it completely off, and he grabs a few smooth stones, and he grabs his little stick sling, and he goes out, and the Philistine threatens him, if you come any closer, I will destroy you like I destroyed all the other Israelites. And David said, come on. And David took his stick and his smooth stone, and he threw it at the Philistine and sunk it in his forehead. And then, to make things really gross, he goes and grabs the Philistine's sword and beheads him and throws the head of the Philistine towards the Philistine army, and they retreat. The moral of that story is don't mess with a guy with a stick and a stone. But David does. It's an interesting thing that says in the text, as we end the text this morning, it says in the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, that from the day that David was anointed, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, which sounds very nice, only that's not what it says in Hebrew. It says this. It says the Spirit of the Lord gripped him. I love that. The Spirit of the Lord gripped him, and in the grip of the Spirit, David was able to perform all these acts all these kingly acts. You know the rest of the story. Saul becomes crazy, tries to kill David, and then Saul finally dies, and David becomes king. You know the story. One of the points of the story is, it seems, is that when God begins to peer at us, there are two things that seem to be going on there. One is that God does not look at us in judgment, but looks at us with a discerning heart, a kindness, a loving kindness towards us. And the other connotation there is that God looks into our hearts to see what is there. God looks more deeply than we typically look. And because of God's looking deeply in us, we are able also to open ourselves up to God, open ourselves up to what God already can see, and to look within ourselves to see what God sees within us. So for the writer in the Ephesians, which is attributed to Paul, who knows who wrote it actually, but it's Pauline nonetheless, because it sounds like Paul. So the text there is really interesting, because what it says is this: you're all born into darkness. There is a certain inability to see within us all, but you are children of light. And then it says, try to find out. It's an admonition. Find out where the light is and show it to the world. That's Paul's admonition to the people of God. Find out where it is and witness to it. And it's not saying this nicely or gently. He is really commanding those who have experienced the light and the love, the compassion of God, to show it to all people. Be the light in the world. So there's a wonderful story of my favorite preacher of all time, Fred Craddock, God rest his soul, tells a story about being in Israel, being in Jerusalem. And he's in Jerusalem, and he's taken this tour of this famous chapel, a chapel that supposedly sits at the site of where the Pool of Siloam was. And so they're in groups, and they're going through in groups, and the group ahead of them has this wonderful tour guide, who is telling them about this is the site on which the Pool of Siloam was. It existed here, and it was here that Jesus healed the man who was born blind from birth. It was here that the man entered into the pool and washed himself and gained his sight and went back and reported to all the people around that he could now see, that he no longer lived in darkness. And as one group's coming up into that area, they heard this description from the guide of the group ahead of them, and then that group moved out, and this other group moved in. And the tour guide said, supposedly, this is the site where the man who was born blind washed in the Pool of Siloam. But it's probably not here that it existed. It probably existed about a quarter of a mile to the east of here. And that is probably where it all happened. But this is a good enough representation of what had happened here. And this woman turned to him and turned to Fred Craddock and said, I wish I was in the other group. You know what I mean? Sometimes you just wish you could hold on to the stories and the narratives as they are. Sometimes they are so deeply ingrained in us that we wish we could just keep them whole, keep them intact, keep them in such a way that we don't have to do anything. We don't have to ask any questions. We can just hear the stories, take comfort that they're real and true and honest, and we can move about our lives. And Paul says, actually, no, you can't do that. You have to be discerning of heart. You have to listen to the way things sound. You have to check them in your minds and with your heart, and you have to go into the world looking for the truth that is in the light. You cannot live in darkness any longer. Now, the problem with that is that many people are scared. Many people are scared that if they go looking for the real truth, they might find out that things aren't as we think they are, and that things are actually a little different than we thought they were, and that now, because things aren't exactly as they were, everything that we thought we once knew is gone. Nothing is true. There's a fearfulness that happens, particularly in religious communities, that if any one thing is not as exactly as we have been told, then the whole thing is a lie. And you know, and I know, that this life that we live together is a life that leads us continually into the deeper truths of our lives with God, of our lives with each other. And some of it is not pretty. So the reason why I asked you to sit today is because the story of the man born blind is the whole 9th chapter of John's gospel, and it's quite long. It's probably the longest of any of the gospels that you're here in church in our three-year cycle. It's an interesting story all the way around. There is truth, as the man is witnesses to in the text. There is truth to the fact that never in the ancient Near East, there was never ever recorded a story about a man who had been healed having been born blind. There are lots of stories about healers, some of them claim to be messiahs, who had healed a person who had become blind. But never was there a story, historically you can't find it, of a person who was born blind and then had been healed by any human being. So the point there, his point that he was born blind and nobody's ever heard of such a thing, really has some real truth to it. You can look deeply into that and find more truth than you thought was there, actually. And so Jesus sees this man who is born blind, and then the first question anyone asks is this: what's wrong with him? What's wrong with his parents? What happened? What did they do? What did he do? And Jesus says something that blows their minds. He's not a sinner any more than anybody else is, and his family wasn't either. He was born as he was born, in darkness, so that the works of God may be revealed. Now you could take that and say, wow, perhaps all of us are born into a certain darkness. And we're born into that darkness not because we're bad people, but because in us is a continual renewal, continual vision of light that happens over time. And that happening over time is a truth. It's not told to us, but happens to us. Of course, the problem here is that Jesus heals a blind man on the Sabbath, and that upsets the Jewish religious leaders. And so they begin to question the man, tell us what's going on. And the guy says over and over again, all I know is I was blind and I couldn't see. And he rubbed spit and mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. No, you need to tell us exactly what happened. Okay, I was blind, and he rubbed spit and mud on my eyes and told me to go wash, and I washed, and now I see. Something else has to be true here. Either he's a liar or you're a liar. Tell the truth, which is what give glory to God means. Tell the truth. Tell us what really happened. I was blind, and now I see. In the story is the story has grip for us. Because in that story, as you hear over and over again, a man say, I was blind, and now I see. I was blind, and now I see. There's a certain real, it's not a trick. It's a literary narrative of leading there for John's gospel that leads us to the point where maybe we can say that so many times in the story. I was blind, and now I see. I was blind, now I see. I was blind, now I see. And we're reading the story, and all of a sudden we begin to think, wait a minute. Who are we talking about here? I was blind, and now I see. So this is called, by any account, a miracle. That a man who is blind and born into darkness can see anything of value, anything of deep worthiness in this world. It is a miracle that anybody can attest to anything good, being that we all have a hard time seeing anyway. So one of the things that drives me up the wall is when somebody comes to me and says, you know, if you were just able to look at this a little differently, your troubles would be gone. If you were able to see in a spiritual way, the way I see it, you would be able to have the same spiritual depth that I have. Don't you love it when people talk to you like that? Don't you want to just not be Jesus and slap them? We have a certain disdain for someone who claims to see and claims to be able to see what we cannot see, as if our lives and as our experience in life is not worthy of any kind of light or truth. We hear people tell us, and sometimes those people look like I do. They wear collars, and anyway. So they believe that they are able to show us something that we have not yet seen. And why that drives you crazy and why it drives me crazy is because we know that that does not come from a spirit of humility. It comes from someone who thinks they have seen what nobody else has seen. And so there's no witness there. There's no witness at all. It's not, I have seen, can you see? It's, you don't see because. You see? You see? There is the power of the story. The power of the story is this, is that a man has seen and told the story. That's it. That's the gospel. To see and to tell the story, to give glory to the God who gives light and sight.